4 volumes, Sources of Social Power, as well as Incoherent Empire, Dark Side of Democracy, and the Fascists. Let me introduce myself. My name is Dmitry Karashev. I'm PhD in sociology and Russian translator and scientific editor of Sources of Social Power. And Nikolai Prochenko is a Russian famous journalist, as well as translator of Immanuel Wallerstein volumes, Modern World System. Dear Professor Mann, thank you for taking the time to answer our question. It's my pleasure to speak with you. Let me begin with a short question about your personal COVID and lockdown experience. How did you spend the lockdown? For many people, it was a stressful experience, and how about you?
No, not dreadful, because I live in a rather idyllic part of Los Angeles. I live on a house on a canal, and we have a large garden, and I'm not on my own. I have a wife, and though it's hard being deprived of contact with our children who don't live anywhere near here, it's had its problems. But the positive thing is that it gave me plenty of time to virtually finish a book on war. So I can't complain. I mean, elsewhere in Los Angeles, there are many, many people who had a dreadful experience, where the housing is packed together and where 3 generations live in the same small apartment. And that's quite different.
Yes, I understand you. And do please tell us about your new book.
Yes, it would be very interesting to know your opinion regarding how the war power, military power transforms in contemporary world, because for us this is a quite very interesting thing, because we see a lot of transformation in ideological power, in economical and political, and military power sometimes seems obscure. So what is your opinion about this transformation?
Right. Well, I should first of all say that my book is about war throughout history and across the world, with serious case studies in Europe, China, the history of China, Japan, and Latin America, because these are places that are relatively well documented and where command of English and French made possible reading very widely on it. And when I come to the contemporary period, obviously the United States plays a larger role, as does the Soviet Union and Russia. The fundamental question is to what extent are wars a rational form of human activity? So this is not a book about military power, in the book about wars, right? Obviously there have been major transformations in modern warfare in terms of the lethality of weapons above all, and yet that hasn't made all that much difference to the way that wars are fought, except that armies are much more dispersed nowadays to protect themselves from these lethal weapons. I argue against notions that there has been a decline in war through history. There are some people who say that there's been an increase in war, and I argue against that as well. I say that periods of war and peace are found in all periods of history and continents of the world. Some are more warlike than others for particular reasons. And in the contemporary world, we have in the advanced countries, or at least in the Western advanced countries, we have the illusion of it being a peaceful world. But that doesn't take account of our supplying massive quantities of arms to people who are still engaged in war, or that we fight proxy wars, or many other cases. So war remains a threat, though it's slightly obscured from the point of view of the Western countries. I don't know if it's more prominent in Russia around your frontiers, which is different to that.
Yes. Some proxy wars we had.
Yes. And of course, these wars sometimes come up without much warning. So for those who knew about Nagorno-Karabakh, there was plenty of warning. But in 2020, a war major for those two countries, if not on a massive scale, erupted, and unusually, one side clearly won, and quite quickly. Now, I've forgotten what I was going to say then. Go on, ask another question.
Fine. And what about the prospects of military power in current war? In your works, you always repeat that there is no historical analogy with current American empire military dominance. Yes. So what are the perspectives for this global military disbalance? And my second question is about role of wars with mass mobilization in crystallization of modern state. Current wars are wars with which transfer risk, as you mentioned in sources volume. So it's a kind of different configuration, and it lead to different kind of modern state or postmodern maybe. What is your opinion, Professor?
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, I ask about global military power disbalance and the role of US in it.
Right. Okay. Well, the role of the US has been on a global scale or a near global scale, whereas the comparable cases were all on regional scales. So the Chinese Empire was hegemonic over most of Asia, and yes, and as a result of World War II, which was a world war, the United States and for a time the Soviet Union had much greater power in the world, and the United States was pretty supreme from the late 80s, but with catch, because the belief in the United States that President Reagan had forced the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that belief was common among Republicans in the United States, Democrats too, that it was American military pressure that had defeated the Soviet Union. And though there's an element of truth in that, obviously the main causes are domestic for Soviet collapse. And so that left them overconfident about the capacity of their military to transform societies. And the one thing that is most common in wars throughout history is over-optimism from the power that started it, from the power that intervened in the first place. Because that in general, the initiators of war are more likely to lose them, which is perhaps a counterintuitive finding. The main exceptions being the major powers who found empires, and they basically found empires by conquering much smaller, weaker states. So the United States was over-optimistic about what its military could achieve. This actually started from the Korean War onwards. The remarkable thing about this military superpower is that it has never been able to achieve its goals in war. So the Korean War, was a kind of draw. It was pointless. Vietnam was a defeat, and then came the bunch of wars in Muslim countries, and they have achieved nothing. So this is an incredible record of defeat. Not always on the battlefield. That is, the two invasions of Iraq were successful, but the failure was to achieve the goals that the war was supposed to make possible, to transform the politics and the political and economic power of those countries. So it's been a story of great failure, and risk transfer militarism process that's going on, and yet at the same time, it's clear that the American public don't really have the stomach for even minor numbers of casualties. So that the domestic will, the morale, the ideology of humanitarian interventionism is declining at the moment. And of course, at the same time, we have the rise of China, and specifically Chinese revisionism. Now, revisionist wars are quite common in history. They are about taking back territory that is considered to be legitimately yours. What the Communist Party is doing is trying to restore the boundaries of the Chinese Empire of the past to the largest extent. And that is something that is to re-achieve naval power in the seas off China, take full control of Tibet and of Xinjiang, and to contest American dominance. And this is the big question. By the way, I should add that Russia is involved in the same border revisionism, right? Take parts of the Ukraine, etc. Though Russia has tried its hand at the more American types of military intervention, as in Syria and Libya. In Syria with success, whatever that is, and in Libya with failure. So war is not dead. It's somewhat abstract as far as the advanced countries are concerned. It could still, through proliferation of nuclear weapons or of weapons of mass destruction, it could threaten really serious warfare. There's a low chance of that, I think. At the same time, it would be an utter disaster for humanity if it happened. So much depends on, not so much on Russia, but on the China-United States confrontation in East Asia. And there, I think, much depends on the US making or not exactly withdrawal, but a reduction of the tensions and coming to terms with China. But who knows if that will actually happen.
Thank you, Professor. May I ask you about the war by other means, precisely about US-China trade war and following economic struggle? Does it breed segmented globalization or have global integrations? And what are the prospects of this economic struggle?
Yes, it's reasonable to call them struggles. I don't think the term trade wars is the correct one. the war between Manchester United and Manchester City, or
or between Real and Barcelona.
yes. Yes, I think I should first say that there are two main forms of globalization. One is transnational, where power relations go right through the borders of states, taking no notice of them. And with a little exaggeration, that's, for example, what finance capital does in the world today. But the other one is international globalization, the United Nations being an example of that, but also geopolitical relations of a peaceful kind between states. Now, trade an arena where it is intergovernmental problems which occur. And there is a combination of rivalry, but also interdependence. So it is difficult to see the United States and China becoming economically isolated from each other because they're so interdependent. Because probably most of the clothes I'm wearing are made in China. Certainly the electronic equipment I'm using either China or Korea or somewhere. So I'm not pessimistic about that. I think things will be dealt with.
Okay, maybe one more question which related with the China-US struggle, and the question is, what is the prospects of green energy public spending race between China and the US? From one point, I suppose that it is a kind of Green New Deal in US and China separately. But from another point, it is a mean of economic struggle, no doubt, no doubts. So, what is your opinion?
And what is your common opinion regarding the so-called Green New Deal? Is it a just new form of neo-Keynesianism because of the great state budgets that appointed for those aims of struggle with climate changes?
The Green New Deal is the goal. I mean, it's not stated in great detail, but it's the general goal of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. It's Joe Biden is not a part of that faction. It's a large faction, and it's clear that the arguments there are convincing more people, and that Biden himself has become influenced by them. Green energy, I think it's a kind of healthy thing if China and the United States are competing to in green energy technology. That's what you're talking about. Because that's good for humanity. So I don't see that as a problem.
What about me? I just seen an analogy between US-China spending race on green energy and military expenditure race during the Cold War between USSR and China. Maybe is it a good idea or it's misleading?
Well, the rising military expenditures of China are a source of concern, but at the same time, it's the model for being a great power, and so it was more or less inevitable that Chinese leaders would not only increase their military spending, but modernize their military so that it seriously could challenge the United States. What one hopes that it would be the same form of rivalry as it was with the Soviet Union, that is, nobody actually fires against the other's troops, fight proxy wars, that's all. So I think that the great challenge for the world is of transnational globalization. We should remember that the COVID virus is, like other viruses, is truly transnational and pays no respect whatever to national boundaries. So too is the energy problem. That is, that emissions anywhere affect everywhere. So again, that's just thoroughly transnational. And so this is one can be ambivalent about economic globalization, one can be for it, against it, whatever. But these are different. These are human beings' relationships with nature. That's not something that I have made a big deal of in my work, except that I did write a chapter on emissions problem. But it's not about the forces of social power in a way. It's about all of them in relation to the world we live in, to the natural world. And clearly the answer to these forms of transnational globalization is international globalization. That is, international agreements throughout the world. And the virus is not, but at the same time, political leaders will recognize that it is a problem to need agreements. Same realization about climate change.
Let me ask one more short question about the Green New Deal, and we will go to the COVID theme. I wonder whether the Green New Deal actually neo-Keynesianism or the next round of neoliberal Ponzi finance, because in short run, high tech and finance corporations will obviously win more from Biden's infrastructure plan, and Main Street in than Main Street in the loan, because you mentioned that it is absence of strict international control of carbon emission. That's why I asking about how you define the Green New Deal. Is it a good thing like neo-Keynesianism, or rather a bad thing, neoliberal trick,
Well, it involves a considerable amount of state intervention. And in that sense, I suppose it's kind of vaguely Keynesian. As you say, its effect is to penalize industrial capitalism, and kind of, it doesn't really benefit finance capital or the kind of non-material production sector of society, but they are unaffected by it. But of course, the proponents of the New Deal, and I think there's some justification in this, they say that there are a different set of industries that will develop in relation to more greener forms of energy production, and that there will be employment there, and there will be investment there, and so it's perhaps a shift of sectors, but that I don't think that leads to neoliberalism. I think neoliberalism is taking a bit of a shock from the COVID crisis. And kind of Biden is the first Democrat since Roosevelt to put in such large sums of money into generating increased employment and the like.
We would like to ask you some questions about the connection between COVID crisis and the crisis of capitalism and the future of capitalism. Let me remind one of your predictions from the volume, Does Capitalism Have a Future? You told that capitalism would be boring, so low percent rates, low inflation, low economic growth. Do you still share this opinion after beginning the COVID crisis? Is capitalism still boring?
Well, capitalism has to adjust to whatever shocks are presented to it, and smart capitalists find profit in all of these things. Like, there's World War, there's a big boost in arms production, and that is maintained after the truth. I think of capitalism as being, in this respect, endlessly adaptive, or some capitalists are, enough to keep it going, enough to produce more sectoral changes. So I don't see a specific crisis of capitalism. Capitalism is threatened by sensible policies in relation to climate change and green energy, because there should be more state regulation of capitalism, but it's not something that threatens private ownership of the means of production. And all the signs are that, in that respect, capitalism is becoming more dominant in economic power relations. The virtual collapse of social democracy in Western Europe is one sign of that. The rise of China, which is, well, it's kind of half capitalist, half statist, let's say, that offers a different model of economic development to that of capitalism. So that is a serious challenge. But though the Chinese authoritarian economic structure has some attractions to poorer countries, so too is capitalism.
May I ask about your metaphors from volumes, Sources of Social Power, precisely the interstitial emergence? Could the COVID-19 be described with that metaphor, or with metaphor of track layer, or a switchman, or neither nor?
The way I have used interstitial emergence is the creation of new social forces, new collective movements, new assemblages of power, but it's social. The emergence of COVID is different from that. It doesn't really come from it comes from nature, and then, of course, it comes from a human social organization in the sense of the globalization of refugee flows, and these are all things that carry it to the world. And so those, but the virus itself is a natural force. So go for that.
The COVID brings great uncertainty to our world, and according to IMP model, during the times of uncertainty, ideological power is especially influential. But did the COVID-19 actually breed a shift in the configuration of this kind of power? Is there any new novelty in post-COVID world?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the bring a, and then I didn't hear the next.
I mean, you say that COVID arised from natural reasons and it is not interstitial emergence. So maybe is there any novelty in post-COVID world? Can we explain this with metaphor of track layer? Whether some new rail tracks created by it or not. It is just a situation of emergency, and when it finished, the things goes back.
Well, it's too soon to tell in the sense we don't know if we're in the second wave, second and last wave, or the second of 6 waves, or whatever. So it might. There are some signs for optimism. I mean, the main one is that though cases mount, deaths do not. Which means that societies, health systems, and the like, and the pharmaceutical industry have responded in ways that lessen the risk of death. So it has been an immense shock to people's private lives, above all, and to employment. Those are the two things. But of course, it's a very reactionary force in some ways because it reinforces inequality. Between countries, rich and poor, and between rich and poor within countries. I mean, that's very striking in the US, where, as well as older people like myself, dying, poorer people as well, and they are more affected by losing employment than people who have more financial cushion. So it's kind of it's not a revolutionary force. It's difficult to see any radical restructuring of society. On the other hand, it has led to some ideological movements in some countries, which are rather disturbing, like the United States or Brazil, or the far right in general in Western countries. And that combined, that's kept buoyant by the different notions of reality presented by different mass media, so that someone who believes in QAnon in the United States, do you know what QAnon is? It's far right conspiracy. That this sounds absurd, but that Democrats are stealing babies and sacrificing them in satanic rituals. No? Well, the answer is they're only tuned in to internet sources which reinforce this. Everything is out there, all the crazies, left, right, and center, are there in the internet, as we all know. So those movements are a little worrying because they disrupt the democratic norms of the society.
Generally, states of emergency reinforce the exceptional regimes. Can COVID-19 facilitate authoritarian turn and resurrect crystallization of modern states that supposedly live in the past? For example, the success of Russian vaccine Sputnik V is a relevant case in that vein. Do you think so?
It's relevant in what way?
I mean, all success were privatized, but all risk nationalized. And now Putin's regime can show, okay, if you think our regime is authoritarian, it's all. But we create the first vaccine, so authoritarian is not so bad if it is about people's life.
Yes, well, of course. That's also the Chinese.
Yeah.
And it's different regimes claim credit and try to avoid blame. So, so Britain, which is now being very successful, it's the National Health Service, which is the sacred item in British culture, and the Conservative government will benefit from this. I mean, governments will benefit if the virus is successfully coped with, and they will be harmed if they're not. I remind you that when I wrote about the Great Depression in the 1930s, I noted that the Depression threw out of power every government that had been there at the beginning, whether of right or left. So a similar effect here, except that it's much more short term than the Great Depression, or so far. A government can get credit for dealing with it, but this is normal politics.
Even Putin, in his recent Davos speech, told that the situation reminds him of the 1930s. Is it a symptom that even politics tell about this?
I don't think it's like the 1930s in that the 1930s was not only about an economic depression, it was about the hangover from World War One and the revisionism of Germany and the defeated powers in World War One in general, of course, which took a different form in Russia than in Germany, Italy, Hungary, Austria, etc. But and so the crisis in the 1930s was much deeper than the crisis today, where there was in the advanced countries a relative peace and a post-war consensus that was just beginning to unravel, and the virus has slightly hastened that, but not greatly, I don't think.
There were no bitcoins, digitalization, financialization in the 1930s. Is it a real factor in world economy? I mean, cryptocurrencies and digitalization. Or is it a symptom of a transit to something new?
I have to reply honestly, I have no idea. Just not an area of expertise for me.
Dear Professor, may I return to the interwar period? What lesson can be drawn from that period? Of course, history doesn't repeat itself, but maybe we can get some historical lesson.
Um, well, I think the lesson would be you should fight extremism at an earlier stage of its development. And to my mind, the big geopolitical failure of the late 1930s was the failure of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union to come to a deal to deter Hitler. And as far as, though it was difficult because of the geography of Poland, to have a solution, it was basically undermined by the fact that the British and the French hated communism more than they hated fascism. So they, Churchill apart, they didn't really think, on the left of the Labour Party, they didn't think that Hitler was as much of a threat. They were wrong. But can we draw? Is such a situation likely to recur? No, because history doesn't repeat itself so exactly as that. And whatever the crises that are bound to emerge as climate change really bites into lives, there will be of a different kind. Though it's perfectly possible that there could be fascist-like movements emerging. And certainly the kind of nativism of immigration policies. Now there's a reaction against the great freedoms of immigration that existed in the recent past. There's a reaction against that towards nativism, and that could become much more dominant if given climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Is the relatively privileged, those in the north, essentially. Canada, the northern states of the US, Russia, Sweden, etc. Would they direct wars to protect themselves from the millions trying to come in from countries which were whose agriculture was being destroyed by climate change?
And may I ask about hegemonic stability perspective? The interwar period brought the decline of British economic hegemony and ended the gold standard. Can we now waiting for decline of U.S. hegemony and dollar era, or without the great total war with mass mobilization, it becomes impossible?
Well, of course, British decline was happening before then. I mean, in the first decade of the 20th century, the GNPs of both Germany and the United States were greater than that of Britain. And though the gold standard continued to exist, its weakness was a fundamental cause of the Great Depression. Sorry. I mean, it should be remembered that the United States ceded Great Britain, the hegemonic power, a much more hegemonic power than Britain had ever been, but it took over that role entirely peacefully. Right? Never been, not since 1812, has there been an armed confrontation between Britain and the United States. So it's perfectly possible for hegemony to be transferred peaceably, but it's not likely that there would be a new hegemon. It's much more likely that the United States would remain the first among equals, but there would be some other equals, most notably China. The European Union being a case of economic challenge, but no other challenge. So I'm not pessimistic about that. I don't think that there is likely on these kinds of grounds to generate wars. And wars are more likely through specific military causes, like the proliferation of nuclear weapons. If you believe that paradise awaits you if you kill the infidels, then that's seriously worrying. And climate change could lead to disasters. I don't think so much of wars as mass starvation, perhaps some genocides, but not wars between great powers.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask one more question about European Union and the UK. What is your opinion about Brexit? Is it all about London City desire to be a global financial center, or it's all because China and its trading relation with some continental European countries?
No. Brexit resulted for two main reasons. One, immigration, which and very curious, really, because it's all the Brexit changes is immigration from the European Union, and so this isn't racism in the American sense. It's aimed at white immigrants, and of course Middle Eastern ones as well. So there's immigration, and a substantial part of the base of the Labour Party shifted over and voted Conservative and for Brexit as a result of that fear of immigration. And you find the same kind of sentiments in the United States. That's the first thing. The second thing is something that may be difficult to understand. It's old style obsession with sovereignty and the imperial history and the anti-European movement that focused on decision making abroad rather than our own decisions. So these sentiments completely outweigh economic rationality to harm the British economy quite considerably. But those arguments are genuinely held by a slight majority of the country, and will result in further, probably in Scottish independence, and in the long run in Irish unification.
Yes, I'd like to return to the different governments' responses to COVID crisis. Could different responses lead to divergent national paths of following development or not? For example, anti-crisis spending.
Sorry, say that again.
I'd like to ask you about may different government response to the pandemic crisis led to divergent national paths of following development or not? Like in punctured equilibrium theory.
Well, I think it's too early to say, and of course, success, relative success or failure to deal with the crisis has followed quite idiosyncratic paths. So there are countries that one would have expected would deal much better with the crisis than they have, like France. And there are others that have done much better, and there are others that have done better in some phases than others. So that suddenly the United States is doing very well, when it had done very badly while Trump was president, though I don't blame everything on Trump. So it's kind of, there's a pattern in the questioning, which is that you're trying to relate these specific events to more general theoretical concepts. And though I have produced some general theoretical concepts, I also have a very high valuation of empirical diversity, complexity, idiosyncrasy. And so my model of the sources of social power is only a kind of broad orienting framework, a hard-nosed theory. So I think that the challenge that human societies face vary through time, and the 20th century was distinguished by both highest rates of growth, economic growth, the most major wars ever fought, and then a second half century of relative peace, brandishing nuclear weapons, but not using them. And so I'm stating some things that are where the sources of social power go in different directions, and they will probably continue to do so in ways that we can't quite predict.
And finally, let's touch upon one very important theme for the Russians. I mean, the 30th anniversary of the Soviet Union collapse this year. Could you tell us about your vision of this tragic for us event? It seems it's a kind of a typical example of the collapse of all the four sources of social power, and it was not predicted by the scientists. But now, could you find it the very logic conclusion of the Soviet system in its 70 years history?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Soviet Union. I wrote a piece on it some years ago. I haven't kept up with the literature in this respect. It's interesting to contrast the Soviet Union with China. And the Chinese regime was already before Soviet collapse, but Soviet collapse reinforced their view, already separating economic from political power. And therefore, you could loosen controls over the economy, have it more decentralized. I mean, there was still a complex economy where political and economic forces are wrapped up together, but there is a relative autonomy granted to the economy at the same time as the party, the political power, maintained its primacy, and they survived. The Soviet Union tried to reform all at once and collapsed.
So,
smarter than the Russians.
yeah, dear colleagues, we spent 1 hour.
Yes.
Thank you for being with us, Professor Mann, and for agreeing to answer our questions. It was a great experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the great discussion.
Thank you. Your English is very good, as I read.
We tried.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.